Welcome to a space where silence is finally understood, not misread. This is your journey into the hidden psychology of connection and distance. If you're ready to see what most people never notice, you're in the right place. And before we begin, make sure you become a member of my channel, Avoidant Decoded, where we break down the truths behind avoidant behavior, emotional dynamics, and the patterns that shape your relationships. Tonight, I want to share something most people overlook. Not because it's hidden, but because avoidant individuals are incredibly skilled at pretending it isn't there. This is about why avoidants often start to break down emotionally after an empath finally goes quiet, and why the moment they believe they've gained control is often the exact moment their inner world begins to quietly unravel. Avoidants and empaths exist on completely different emotional frequencies. One feels deeply, intensely, and openly. The other keeps emotions at a distance, using space as protection. One leans into connection, while the other instinctively pulls away to feel safe. In the beginning, this contrast can almost feel balanced, even comforting, like two opposites filling in each other's gaps. But over time, that balance slowly turns into tension. The empath keeps giving, offering understanding, patience, softness, and consistent emotional effort. They try to love the avoidant through their walls. Meanwhile, the avoidant continues to retreat, resist closeness, and guard their inner world behind distance. What most people don't realize is that the avoidance breakdown doesn't start during arguments or conflict. It starts the moment the empath stops pouring emotional energy into the connection, because what felt like control for the avoidant was never truly self-sustained. It was quietly supported by a dynamic they didn't fully understand. Avoidants aren't really managing relationships. They are avoiding emotional experiences altogether, and the only reason they can keep doing that without immediately falling apart is because the empath is there, absorbing the weight. The empath's patience, compassion, and emotional presence act like a cushion, a safe landing that shields the avoidant from fully facing what's inside them: unresolved pain, fear, emptiness, and old wounds. As long as the empath keeps giving, the avoidant never has to confront those deeper layers. To them, the empath's energy becomes something essential, almost like emotional oxygen. It keeps them steady without requiring vulnerability. They may not admit it, but that presence regulates them. It allows them to feel wanted without effort, reassured without opening up, and important without fully investing. The empath isn't just loving them, they are stabilizing their entire emotional world through consistency and care. Over time, the avoidant starts to see this as normal. They assume the connection will always be there, always available, no matter how much they pull away. They believe they can keep distancing themselves while the empath continues to reach. But eventually something changes. The empath becomes quiet, not out of anger, not as punishment, and not to manipulate, but out of pure exhaustion. It's not a cold silence, it's a depleted one, a quiet message that says, "I can't keep carrying this alone." At first, the avoidant barely notices. They assume it's temporary, just a pause like before. In their experience, things always return to how they were. But as the silence continues, something unfamiliar begins to rise: instability. The emotional support they unknowingly depended on is no longer there, and without it, something inside them begins to crack. This is where the real collapse starts, not on the outside, but internally. Avoidants often believe their strength comes from emotional distance. They feel in control when they disconnect, safe when they shut down. But when the empath's presence disappears, that same distance starts to feel different. It no longer feels like protection, it starts to feel like isolation. And isolation doesn't create strength, it creates exposure. For the first time, they are left alone with everything they've been avoiding. There's no one absorbing the impact anymore, no one softening their defenses, no one filling the emotional gaps they refuse to look at. What remains is everything they push down: insecurities, fear of closeness, fear of being abandoned, emotional hunger, and unresolved pain. All of it begins to rise at once, with nowhere to escape. Their defenses start to weaken under the weight of emotions they never processed. And this collapse doesn't come with chaos or loud reactions. It happens quietly, in still moments, in the absence of what used to feel normal. They begin to notice what's missing: the warmth that used to be there, the understanding they once received without asking. They feel a kind of longing they convinced themselves they didn't need, and slowly, regret begins to surface, not always in obvious ways, but deeply within, because silence has a way of bringing clarity. They start to realize that what the empath gave wasn't easy to replace, that they never truly had control, that their distance always came with a cost. The collapse happens because they are finally left alone with themselves, without the emotional cushion they depended on. What once felt like safety through distance now feels like emptiness. The very strategy they use to protect themselves becomes the thing that exposes them, and what they lose isn't just the person, it's the emotional structure that person was quietly holding together, the feeling of being seen, the sense of being valued, the emotional grounding they had without effort. And when that disappears, everything inside begins to shift. This isn't just about losing someone, it's about losing the balance that person was unknowingly providing. And for the first time, the avoidant is forced to face everything they spent their life running from. Avoidants often mistake silence as strength. They use it to regain control, to avoid overwhelm, to protect themselves. But in the end, that same silence becomes the space where everything they avoided finally catches up with them. Silence becomes their safe place. And for a long time it seems to work, because the empath keeps filling the space they leave behind. Every time the avoidant pulls away, the empath leans in. Every time communication fades, the empath restores it with patience, care, and understanding. Because silence is always met with connection, the avoidant starts to believe that silence gives them control. But that belief only lasts until the empath responds differently, until the empath also goes quiet, not to manipulate, not out of anger, but because they've reached their emotional limit. Empaths don't withdraw easily. They do it when they feel unheard, when giving starts to feel like losing themselves, when love turns into exhaustion instead of connection. And when that shift happens, everything changes. Silence no longer feels like control. It starts to feel like loss. It no longer feels powerful. It begins to feel unsettling, heavy, unfamiliar. The stillness that once felt safe now sits like pressure in the chest. And in that quiet, the avoidant starts to see something they've spent years avoiding. Their silence was never true strength. It was fear, disguised as control. They depended more than they realized, on the empath's patience, on their willingness to stay, on their ability to forgive, to understand, to keep showing up. For a long time, that dependence went unnoticed because it was hidden inside the illusion of independence. It felt stable, predictable, even comfortable in its imbalance. The empath kept adjusting, kept interpreting the silence, kept making sense of the distance. And in doing so, they unknowingly became the emotional foundation the avoidant never had to build for themselves. But once the empath goes quiet, that entire structure begins to shift. It doesn't happen with drama. There's no sudden explosion, no loud confrontation. It's subtle, almost invisible at first, like something in the atmosphere has changed. The avoidant is suddenly without a buffer, without someone regulating the emotional space, without the presence that once softened everything. And in that absence, silence stops being protection. It becomes a mirror. And what it reflects is not strength or independence, but something far more uncomfortable: emptiness. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet psychological sense. A lack of emotional grounding when there's no one else holding the connection together. This is where the avoidant begins to break internally, because the empath's silence reveals something they've always avoided seeing. They were never fully self-sufficient in their distance. What they called independence was often supported by someone else, quietly maintaining the connection behind the scenes. Every time they withdrew, someone was still there, still present, still softening the consequences of their absence. Without that presence, without the warmth, reassurance, and emotional consistency, the avoidant is left alone with everything they avoided feeling: loneliness, insecurity, longing, regret. At first, these feelings don't show up clearly. They come as restlessness, a sense that something feels off, even if nothing obvious has changed. The mind tries to explain it away. I just need space. I'm fine. This is better. But the body tells a different story: tightness in the chest, a quiet tension in the stomach, a constant awareness that something familiar is missing. And suddenly, the silence becomes louder than anything they tried to escape before, louder than conflict, louder than emotional conversations, louder than distance itself, because this time, they are not the one controlling it. They can choose to withdraw, they can choose to shut down, but they cannot control the empath doing the same. And that loss of control activates something deeper, a fear they rarely admit, even to themselves. The fear of losing someone who mattered far more than they ever allowed themselves to show. Avoidants often believe silence equals strength, that not reacting means not being affected. But the empath's silence completely breaks that illusion, not through confrontation, but through absence, because absence removes the structure that once made them feel safe. And in that space, memories begin to surface. Not always specific moments at first, but emotional impressions, times when the empath stayed, when they softened tension, when they tried to understand without asking for too much. But those memories don't feel comforting anymore. They feel unfinished, unresolved, almost confronting, and that's when the discomfort deepens. What started as quiet turns into noise inside their mind. The same mind that once used detachment to stay regulated now feels overwhelmed. Thoughts begin to loop. Did I push too far? Why did they stop reaching out? Why does this feel different now? Externally, they may still appear calm, composed, detached. But internally, everything is shifting. The system that once felt stable is no longer balanced, because avoidance was never the absence of emotion. It was just a delay, a way of pushing feelings aside until they felt distant enough to ignore. But now, there's nothing left to soften those emotions, no reassurance, no one interpreting the situation for them, no one maintaining the connection, just space. And in that space, everything rises at once. Fear, loneliness, guilt, confusion, longing, pain that was never fully processed. These emotions don't come in gently. They come all at once because they were never allowed to be felt in smaller pieces. They were stored, avoided, postponed, until the mind has no choice but to face them together. Now the avoidant is left trying to manage that internal storm without the emotional support they unknowingly relied on. And once again, silence becomes a mirror. It reflects the distance they created, the coldness they justified, the space they insisted they needed, and the impact of choices they never fully allowed themselves to feel. Most importantly, it forces a realization they can't easily escape. They didn't just lose the empath. They pushed away the one person who consistently tried to see them, understand them, and stay connected despite everything. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It unfolds slowly. First awareness, then resistance, then discomfort, then eventually acceptance, because avoidant patterns don't erase emotion, they only delay it, and when it finally arrives, it often arrives all at once. At this stage, their usual coping methods stop working, distractions don't help the same way, detachment no longer brings relief, logical explanations don't quiet the feeling, even physical distance doesn't create control anymore, because the emotional connection has already been activated inside. They can't blame the empath for being too emotional, there's only silence now. They can't say they needed space because the space feels empty, not freeing. They can't convince themselves it's independence because what they feel is closer to emotional abandonment from within. And in that quiet, unavoidable moment, something becomes clear. They were never just avoiding the empath. They were avoiding their own vulnerability. And now, there's no escape from it. Silence removes the stories they used to protect themselves. It strips away the excuses, the distractions, the emotional noise. What's left is raw truth. And for someone who built their identity around avoiding that truth, it feels like everything is collapsing. Not because something outside has broken, but because what's inside can no longer hold what's been ignored. Thoughts feel heavier, time feels slower. Even small moments carry emotional weight. A song, a place, a routine, everything starts to echo with what was lost or what was never fully acknowledged. This is why the empath's silence becomes a turning point. Not because it punishes, not because it tries to get even, but because it reveals. It removes the final layer of avoidance and brings forward the one thing that was always postponed, self-confrontation. And once that begins, there's nowhere left to run. Only the quiet realization that what was avoided in the relationship was never separate from what was unprocessed within. And now both meet in the same silence. Because in the end, they relied on the empath's willingness to keep trying. For a long time, they depended on the other person's patience, their ability to forgive, their emotional strength. That dependence stayed hidden, masked by the belief that the avoidant was the one in control. But everything changes the moment the empath goes quiet. What's left behind isn't the calm they expected. It's a silence that doesn't comfort, it exposes. Because without someone constantly offering warmth, reassurance, and emotional presence, there's nothing left softening the distance between them. And in that space, silence stops feeling empty. It turns into a mirror, and what it reflects is something they've spent their whole life trying not to see. This is where avoidance starts to break down, because the empath's silence reveals a truth they were never ready to face. They were never as emotionally independent as they thought. What felt like self-sufficiency was often supported by someone else doing the emotional work, closing the gap they refused to cross. Now that support is gone, and what's left is everything they avoided: loneliness, insecurity, longing, regret. The quiet becomes louder than any argument they once escaped, louder than confrontation, louder than distance, and this time they're not in control of it. They can pull away, they can shut down, but they can't make the other person come back and fill the space anymore. That loss of control brings something deeper to the surface, a fear that's always been there, the fear that if no one is reaching for them, maybe they aren't as important as they believed. For years, they confused being pursued with being loved. If someone chased them, they felt wanted. If someone forgave them, they felt secure. If someone kept trying, they felt safe enough to keep their distance. Over time, they started to believe that love would always look like that. Step back and the other person steps closer. Withdraw and someone follows. Stay distant and someone else will always close the gap. But when the empath becomes silent, that pattern shatters, because this silence isn't a tactic. It's not a reaction meant to pull them back in. It's not hidden pursuit, it's peace, and that's what makes it so unsettling. Peace doesn't argue, it doesn't beg, it doesn't explain. It simply stops showing up. And when that happens, the avoidant is forced into a realization they were never prepared for. They're no longer being chased, not as punishment, but because the dynamic itself has ended. This is where things start to fall apart. Because that pursuit wasn't just attention, it was how they felt important without having to be vulnerable. It was how they experienced being valued without consistently showing up. Now that it's gone, something uncomfortable rises to the surface, a feeling of being replaceable, or worse, not chosen at all. And that cracks something inside them. They begin to understand what they have avoided for so long. That silence they once thought was strength wasn't strength at all. It was a privilege created by someone who stayed longer than they should have. Now, the empath's quiet carries a message that's impossible to twist or reinterpret. I'm no longer putting energy into something you won't meet me in. That message hits deeper than anger ever could, because anger still holds emotion, it still holds connection. Silence means it's finished. And that finality forces them to sit with themselves, without distraction, without someone else absorbing the weight of what they feel. Avoidant patterns are built around escaping discomfort, pushing feelings away, disconnecting before things get too intense. These habits don't just appear overnight, they're learned early and reinforced over time as a way to cope. But coping only works up to a point. As long as the empath stayed emotionally engaged, the avoidant didn't have to face their inner world. They could deflect, rationalize, detach, and keep their distance without real consequences. But now, there's no one buffering that space, no reassurance, no emotional translation, no soothing presence, just stillness. And in that stillness, everything they've been holding back rises all at once. Fear, loneliness, guilt, regret, confusion, emotional hunger. It doesn't come in slowly. It floods in because it was never processed, only postponed. That's why the silence feels unbearable. Not because it's empty, but because it's full of everything they've been avoiding. It reflects the impact of their distance, the coldness they justified, the space they insisted on, and the consequences they never fully faced. Most importantly, it forces a truth they can't run from anymore. They didn't lose someone who failed to love them. They lost someone who loved them consistently while they kept pulling away. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It settles in slowly, but deeply. In the quiet, memories start to feel different. Moments they once brushed off begin to matter. The affection they ignored takes on new meaning. The patience they took for granted starts to feel rare. They remember the effort, the softness, the consistency that was always there even when they weren't. And for the first time, they see it clearly. The empath wasn't asking for perfection. They were asking for presence. And presence is exactly what avoidance struggles to give. Now, with connection replaced by silence, the avoidant finally sees the cost of their pattern. Not just the relationship, but the emotional safety they didn't even recognize while they had it. At this point, their usual ways of coping stop working. Detachment doesn't bring relief. Rationalizing doesn't make sense anymore. Distraction doesn't numb the weight. They can't blame the other person for being too emotional because there's no emotional pursuit left. They can't say they needed space because the space no longer feels freeing. They can't frame independence as strength because what's left feels like emptiness. And in that emptiness, something becomes clear. They weren't just avoiding the other person. They were avoiding their own vulnerability. And now there's no way around it. Silence strips away every excuse, every story they told themselves to soften reality. What's left is raw truth. And for someone who built their identity around avoiding that truth, it feels like everything is collapsing. Not because something outside is breaking, but because what's inside can no longer hold what's been buried. This is why the empath's silence becomes the turning point. Not because it's meant to hurt, but because it reveals everything that was hidden. It removes the noise that once made avoidance feel manageable and replaces it with clarity that can't be ignored. And once that clarity sets in, there's nowhere left to run. In the end, what looked like strength was never real strength. It was a pattern built on distance, avoidance, and relying on someone else to carry the emotional weight. For a long time, they believed silence meant control, that pulling away meant safety, that someone else would always come back and fill the space they left behind. But the moment the empath stops chasing, everything changes. Because now, That silence isn't something they can control, predict, or influence. It's not rejection. It's not anger. It's not punishment. It's simply the end. And that's what makes it powerful. It removes the emotional support system they didn't even realize they depended on. It takes away the reassurance, the pursuit, the constant understanding that kept their inner world from surfacing. And without it, they're left alone with everything they tried to avoid: unprocessed emotions, buried fears, loneliness, regret, and the truth that distance never protected them from pain. It only delayed it. The empath's silence becomes the final reflection, not showing who the empath was, but revealing who they became in that dynamic, what they avoided, what they lost, and what they never faced. That's where the real collapse happens, not because love disappeared, but because the belief that love would always chase them did. And in the quiet that follows, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The connection didn't end when the empath walked away. It was slowly undone long before that, every time fear replaced presence, and every time avoidance took the place of honesty. Once that truth settles in, the silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels final. The silence that once felt like power reveals itself as truth. The avoidant doesn't collapse because the empath left. They collapse because, for the first time, they are left alone with everything they spent years avoiding. What they called control was never strength. It was comfort borrowed from someone who kept showing up. And when that presence turns into peace, not pursuit, it forces a realization that can't be escaped. Real connection was never something to run from, but something they never learned how to hold.